Thank you all for joining in this afternoon. It's a particularly pertinent time to talk about the words justice and Palestinians in a sentence, given what has happened over the last many months. Somewhere between 40 to 200,000 Palestinians have been killed, and the government's policy in this area as a result is so important. And today we'll get to hear a little bit about what direction, where we are and what direction we should be moving in. And we have an amazing panel of speakers for you. And we're going to begin with Ehab Omar, who works as an engineer in the technology sector, a co-founder of the British Palestinian Families Network, which focused on advocating for an on-Palestinian narrative with parliamentarians and with the media. He is also is the campaigns officer for Children Not Numbers, a British charity with a focus on providing medical support for those injured in Gaza. So I'm going to ask you to give a warm round of applause for Ehab as he addresses.
My name is Ehab. I'm Palestinian. I'm from Gaza. And for those who don't know, Gaza is a small city on the Mediterranean, which has been receiving, I would say, an unexpected interest from media for the most brutal of reasons. And albeit I can't recognize my own city among the rubble, the destruction, blood and tears, I do still remember the blue waves, the sailors calling for the sweetest ever watermelons, and the giggles of the children in the background when they go to school in the mornings, and the smell of the roses in my grandmom's garden. But I think my question is for all of you today: how are you? And how are you all? And this is the most difficult of questions I'm asked on every Monday morning, while my heart will start screaming, tell them about your uncle Fayez executed in his own house, in his own house. Tell them about your cousin Wael, the promising app developer who was killed queuing for bread. Tell them about your aunties displaced again and again. And tell them about baby Omar, who was buried with his mom in one grave because she was cuddling him when they were killed together. And tell them about Fadi, my friend, who has his house demolished 3 times in the last 20 years. Tell them about Sami, my friend, my age, who can't find his cancer treatment now. And most recently, tell them about my auntie Hanan, who died a couple of days ago. And I'm wondering who actually will take care of her roses in her own garden. Strange feeling when you have your memories, your life, you feel all of those dissipating, escaping your hand like sand grains on a beach. But I also usually answer, I'm fine. How are you today? How was your weekend? It was once said by a tyrant that a single death is a tragedy, but 1 million deaths are statistics. And we are moving now to the 41,000 people, maybe 200,000 people, and the number is increasing. This carnage is not a reaction to an action. It's an implementation of decades-long of dehumanization strategy against the Palestinians. We are only promised existence, mere existence in nylon makeshift tents. We should just wait for the next meal to be fed, basically in your own land. Just mere existence to accept whatever those birds of hell will throw on your head in terms of leaflets to move, or you will be killed. And you will be killed anyway, nobody cares. It's another number added to the statistics. A mere existence that the majority of the superpowers in this world has accepted as an answer to the Palestinian question, including our own brothers and sisters. We allowed them existence. How dare they request more? Gaza is not where it all started. It's the place where our belief in a just word is being dissipated. It's our belief we are witnessing the failure of a rule-based system to combat genocidal intent and actions. And once single life is deemed expendable, our collective humanity will be eroded. We were told that the public do not care about foreign issues. So we have hundreds of thousands of people marching every day across the capitals of the world, including in this country, and we have people waiting outside in the rain, marching for Palestine. Thousands of people crying for ceasefire, and unexpected election results. We were told that Palestine is fringe issues, that the media would like us to think. But I was told, I had the lessons learned from a farmer in Cheshire, British white guy, who told me, I know it's complicated, but these are our only children. A kind reminder of our collective humanity. Gaza is not a foreign issue, as long as our country has logistical pieces in the Middle East, and where our own British companies are exporting arms to Israel, and our own pensions are invested on those companies. Gaza is not minorities' issue, as previous government guidance are being used in schools to deny us our own existence as Palestinians. As my daughter's teacher told her, but Palestine is not on the map. And she answered him 6 years ago, she was 6 years old, but if I'm Palestinian, Palestine exists. And it's the same rules and guidance are being used in universities now to stop lecturers and students to express their own views within the law, a key fundamental of our own democracy. Gaza is not a foreign issue, as somebody in my locality posts his son's picture in IDF form with a big smile on his face, with the destruction in the background, destruction of my own Gaza. And I wonder if that's the smile of the person who killed Faiz, my uncle. You never know. We are all the actors of change. And there's another life where justice will abide. And if we don't save Gaza, we'll not only lose heavenly Jerusalem, we'll lose even our own souls. But we are all here for a reason. And if the people of Gaza can wake up every day and endeavor to hope, we can do a lot from our point and place of privilege today in sunny Liverpool. You can do a lot. Challenge and push the boundaries and the narrative. And remember that, as reminded by David Lammy earlier today, that it was actually Thatcher who put an arms embargo on Israel until 1994. It's Thatcher who said, and I quote, "You cannot be selective in your defense of law. You can't say, I like this law, I will uphold this law, and I will not uphold the other." And remember, it was this party which pushed for the unthinkable, a peace in Northern Ireland. Challenge how our pensions are being invested in, quote unquote, illegal settlements, arms companies. And help us to combat anti-Palestinian sentiments in schools and universities where we are denied our own nationhood and our own trauma. And help us to build bridges between Britain and Palestine by helping British charities like Children Not Numbers to evacuate injured children for treatment in the UK. And for those politicians in the room, tell your constituents that we listen and there is hope. Finally, I was once told by a Srebrenica genocide survivor that wars start with a pen and end with a pen. Let us all be the ink for justice, peace, and conciliation. Thank you.
Speaking next is Yasmine Ahmed, who is the UK Director of Human Rights Watch. She has 2 decades of experience as a public international lawyer and human rights advocate. In her current role, she advocates for the United Kingdom's foreign and domestic policies to be consistent with human rights, which is perhaps most pertinent than it's ever been in my lifetime. Prior to Human Rights Watch, Yasmine was an executive director of the multi-award-winning human rights organization Rights and Security International. She also worked as a public international lawyer for the UK and Australian government and the United Nations at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the Serious Crimes Unit in Timor-Leste. So again, give a big and warm round of applause for Yasmine.
Well, thank you very much to ICJP for having me on the panel, and thank you very much to all of you for taking the time to be here today. Today's panel is about Labor's role in justice for Palestinians. That question could not be more pertinent than it is today. Over the last year, we have seen nothing but devastation. We initially, and we have for decades, have seen the devastation of the lives of Palestinians. It didn't start on October the 7th. It started decades before that. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, many other human rights, UN, former Israeli officials have acknowledged that what is happening to the Palestinian people in the occupied territories is in fact the crime against humanity of apartheid. And what does that mean? That means the most systematic, systemic and severe discrimination against a people by another, the purpose of which is to dominate and suppress those people. We then had October the 7th, and everyone, I would hope, in this room would acknowledge that that in fact was unlawful killing and unacceptable on every single level. And what we have had since then is a relentless attack against the Palestinians, who for 16 years have been barricaded in Gaza. 16 years have been unable to leave Gaza, except very exceptional circumstances. Decades of oppression in the West Bank. What we have seen in Gaza is the use by Israel of starvation as a weapon of war. I say that many times because we found that as Human Rights Watch early in the conflict. But just to think about that, starving a people, starving them as a means of winning a war, starving all of the Palestinian people in Gaza. And we've seen the repercussions of that. Children dying, women unable to lactate for their babies. We've also seen relentless attacks against Palestinian civilians and civilian objects. We've seen unlawful attacks on hospitals, on humanitarian convoys and premises. We've seen again and again the risk of forcible transfer of the Palestinian population, not once, not twice, but multiple times. And what we have seen is a relentless, as well, uptick in the violence in the West Bank. Over 100 Palestinians, including children and women, have been killed in the West Bank in 2024 alone. So what has this Labor government committed to? This Labor government has committed to a rules-based international order. They have committed to the rule of law, and we welcome that. They have also committed in that context to ensuring that they uphold, and we would like to hear this and this confirmed, to uphold any arrest warrant that may be issued by the ICC against Israeli officials and Hamas officials, and that they will in fact give effect to that arrest warrant. We have heard them talk about and made commitments to a two-state solution and a peaceful settlement of the ongoing conflict. And importantly, what have we seen them do? So we did see them initially, and this is very welcomed. We initially saw them reinstituting the money, the suspension of the money to UNRWA. We saw them withdrawing the application to the ICC, which was an argument to say that Israeli officials, that ICC did not have jurisdiction over Israeli officials. And more recently, we have seen the announcement of an arms suspension in relation to 30 of exports that are going directly to Gaza. But what I would say now is that whilst this is very welcome and the trajectory is welcome, this should be the what is expected, a bare minimum to get us to a place in light of what we have seen over the last year and decades, and in light of where the Labor Party says they want to see the situation go to. This is a bare minimum. What we need to see is a Labor Party with vision and with a strategy on how are we going to ensure that there is justice for Palestinian people, that they enjoy the human rights that are enshrined in international treaties and in international law. How are they going to ensure that we're going to get to a point now which is further than we were a year ago from a place of any kind of peaceful resolving of this situation? A case where we're seeing settlements only expanding, violence get worse, apartheid entrenching, and lives being lost every day. So what are we saying to the Labor Party that needs to be done? We're saying, first of all, as I said, it was welcome that you suspended 30 of the arms exports to Israel. But they left a loophole that needs to be filled, and every one of you needs to be calling on the Labor Party, and those who are part of the Labor Party need to be agitating internally. It is not acceptable that F-35s, which are the most deadly of the components that we send that are used in Gaza, there is a loophole, and they are still able to get to Israel if they go via third countries or into a pool. We say that that cannot be lawful. If the UK government found that there is a clear risk of serious violations of international humanitarian law if they went directly to Israel, those components, how is it possible that that is not a violation if they go indirectly? Our components, the rear fuselage of the F-35 fighter jets, are made here, are made in our country, and are still being able to be exported indirectly to Israel and used in Gaza. We are saying that it wasn't good enough that you did not vote in favour of the resolution last week for the advisory opinion on the illegality of the occupation. We welcomed the fact that you stated that Israel should withdraw from the occupied Palestinian territories at the soonest possible opportunity, and thereby acknowledge the illegality of the occupation. That there should not be any demographic shifts that are done unlawfully. But that is not good enough. The majority of the international community voted in favour of the advisory opinion. That advisory opinion, in fact, stated what international law says. The settlements are unlawful. The occupation is unlawful. So what needs to happen now? We, as Human Rights Watch, are calling on the UK government now in order to implement their international obligations and to get to a point where they had a coherent strategy to move us to where we are, to where they're saying we want to be, which is closer to a peaceful settlement of what is happening. They need to do a full-scale and holistic review of the UK's relationship with Israel. The advisory opinion was very clear. This UK government should not aid and assist, and neither should they recognise as lawful the illegality of Israel's conduct in the occupied Palestinian territories and more generally. This includes trade. Right now, the Labor Party at this moment should be banning settlement goods. They didn't need the advisory opinion for that. They should be revoking the 2030 roadmap. which clearly says that Israel should be provided some kind of exceptional impunity. They should be reviewing all their security, diplomatic, economic relationships to ensure that they're complying with their international obligations and in fact are getting us closer to their stated aim. And very, very importantly, they should be prioritising accountability, because the situation is what it is today. Because for decades, people have been saying, we can't talk about what's happening on the ground in Israel and Palestine and the occupied Palestinian territories because there is a peace process going on and that should be prioritised. Whilst we acknowledge that that is an aim that political parties and others have, that will never, ever be achieved. Peace cannot be achieved unless you recognise the human rights violations that are ongoing. And as the former speaker mentioned, that is true for Northern Ireland, that is true for any situation. So it is critical now that we have accountability at the International Criminal Court, that there is accountability at the Human Rights Council, and the position of the UK government in constantly opposing resolutions on Israel-Palestine at the Human Rights Council has changed, and that this government acknowledges the crimes being committed against the Palestinian people, including the crime against humanity of apartheid and persecution. Thank you.
Speaking next is Sara Husseini. She's the director of the British Palestinian Committee, an independent voice on British policy towards Palestine. In previous roles, Sara has served as an advisor to senior Palestinian officials across a number of offices, including the Secretary General of the PLO and the Palestinian ambassador to Germany. She has supported the work of several civil society organizations, both in Palestine and in the diaspora, and currently sits on the boards of Build Palestine, the Britain Palestine Media Centre, and the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy. So again, please give a warm round of applause to Sara Husseini.
First of all, thank you all for being here. Thank you as well to ICJP for the invitation. Back on the 15th of May this year, South Africa's legal team at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, argued that Israel's offensive in Rafah would be, and I quote, the last stage of total annihilation of Palestinian life. Because without Rafah, the possibility to rebuild and reconstruct Palestinian life will be lost forever. 9 days later, the court ruled that, and again quoting, Israel must immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate. Yet, just minutes after the ruling was delivered, Israel's warplanes carried out a series of airstrikes on Rafah, on the Shabura camp in Rafah, and killed 4 people. And now, we're 4 months on from when the ICJ made that order, and we've seen around half of all the buildings in Rafah destroyed, damaged, as countless Palestinian women, men and children have been killed by Israeli forces. As Ehab alluded to at the beginning, according to a study in The Lancet, it's very likely that the real death toll of Israel's assault on Gaza is close to 200,000 people as we speak. Now, Israel's crimes against humanity, of course, stretch well beyond Rafah and well beyond Gaza. At least 6,400 Palestinians in the West Bank have been killed or injured by Israeli forces since October alone, and thousands more detained in cruel and inhuman conditions in what one Jerusalem-based human rights organisation has called a network of torture camps, triggering an urgent investigation by the Special Rapporteur on Torture. These crimes, as I think Yasmine also pointed out, stretch well beyond the past year. While the scale and intensity of Israel's current assault on the Palestinian people might be unprecedented, what's happening in Palestine today is not the result of a conflict between 2 warring states, competing ethnic claims, or a religious conflict as is often portrayed. In fact, South Africa's lawyers were quite right to point out how Israel's genocidal assault that's been unleashed on the Palestinian people needs to be seen in its full context. That actually what's happening in Gaza today is a culmination of a long history of atrocities that define the Palestinian experience of over a century of settler colonialism. In fact, it was at this very conference in 1944 that Labour adopted a resolution endorsing the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, making the, and I quote, transfer of population official party policy, in which Palestinians would be encouraged to move out of their homeland. And it was during the Labour government of Clement Attlee that the Nakba began, the catastrophe which saw approximately 700,000 Palestinians forced from their homelands by Zionist militia and the State of Israel created on the land of those who were dispossessed. Many of these militia had received training directly from British mandate officials during that period. So 8 years on now from the annual conference, and Labour is once again a government with a landslide majority in the Commons and a palpable opportunity to right the wrongs of the UK's lamentable track record on standing up for justice in Palestine. Now, in broad terms, that would simply mean upholding universal principles, freedom, equality, justice and accountability, values that the Labour Party avows as its own. And we've come a long way since the 1940s with regards to the recognition of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, individual and collective, including the right to self-determination, national independence and sovereignty, and in the right of return, all of which are codified and enshrined in international treaties, conventions and resolutions. And these rights extend to all Palestinians, from Gaza to Jerusalem and the West Bank, to those who managed to stay in their homes in 1948 and those who live in exile. Now, there have been moments, and this was alluded to by one of the previous speakers, across the past 3/4 of the century, when the UK has taken steps to observe its basic legal duties, sanctioning Israel with unilateral arms embargoes or denying it weapons for a number of war crimes its forces have committed. Now, for example, just this past week we commemorated the anniversary of the Israeli-facilitated massacre of thousands of Lebanese civilians and Palestinian refugees in Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon during the war of 1982. That was what led to the UK to suspend its supply of arms sales, the ban that was only fully lifted more than a decade later. And there have been other instances of arms embargoes by previous governments, as recently as 2009 and 2014, in response to Israeli military operations in Gaza. Now, although the failure of successive UK governments to end Britain's complicity in Palestinian dispossession has been quite consistent, the policy position that this new government has inherited from its predecessor is really extreme, even by the UK's own standards. Few former governments have been so proactive in shielding Israel from accountability or so unqualified in their support of war crimes as the Sunak administration was. So this is why it's been really good to see some of the reversals that also previously Ehab and Yasmine mentioned, of some decisions such as the suspension of UNRWA funding, which really was indefensible, particularly at a time when Palestinians being starved, being bombed, being forced from their homes and looking for shelter needed UNRWA services the most. The decision really, in doing that, aligned the UK with a really extreme minority of states who are intent on breaking with the long-standing international consensus on the debt that is owed to the Palestinian refugees by the international community. And it's worth saying UNRWA has been around since 1949. This is an agency that has really contributed, really upheld a thriving Palestinian civil society over all of this time, despite all of the things that Palestinians had to endure under Israeli occupation and apartheid. So the Labour government's reinstatement of funding is an important initial step, and ministers now really need to work to ensure that we raise that amount of funding to a minimum of 2020 levels, as it's been dropped quite significantly since then, and work with international partners to really establish a sustainable mechanism that can ensure that the agency is able to fulfil its mandate without interference, and until a just and durable solution can be found for the plight of Palestinian refugees. Further, it was also a positive step to see the dropping of the previous administration's submission to the ICC on the arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant. And as far as the Foreign Secretary David Lammy stated, and I'm quoting here, the architecture that was created after the Second World War, the rules-based order that we believe so much in, the international legal structure is something that's been a guiding light for the United Kingdom over many years, and that's why we're signatories to the Statute of Rome. We believe in the ICC and the ICJ, end quote. Accordingly, it's imperative that Labour ministers back the cases being brought at the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice as a matter of consistency as well as a matter of legal remedy. Finally, the decision earlier this month to suspend 30 out of the 350 arms export licences to Israel does reflect an acknowledgement by the government that Israel is at very least likely seriously breaching international humanitarian law. And to add a bit of tangibility to this, what this means to continue granting weapons licences out of this 350. The Gaza Ministry of Health last week published a report listing all of the names of the Palestinians that have been killed, that they were able to identify so far. The first 14 pages of that list were babies under the age of 1. This is what it means to continue supplying arms to Israel at this time. So a partial suspension is inadequate, it's inconsistent, and it confirms the UK's repeated failure to fulfil its basic obligations under international law. We immediately need to cease provision of military support to Israel, suspend all of the arms licences, and impose a two-way arms embargo. So now, Keir Starmer's government is presented with the test of its commitment to the universal values of freedom and justice, and to ending our complicity as the UK in those war crimes. We at the British Palestinian Committee cannot stand by as the UK continues to provide this political, diplomatic and military support. And we know that many people in this country and in this room and in the Labour Party more broadly feel the same way. We're going to be releasing a policy guide for the new government next month, soon after the Parliament returns, and that will set out in more detail some of the positions we're going to keep encouraging MPs to pursue. I'm just going to end on a personal note through the diary of my great-grandfather. He's a man named Husseini, and he was the mayor of Jerusalem in the 1930s. In 1937, British authorities exiled him from Palestine, along with 3 other leaders, as one method of quelling political resistance to British occupation at the time. On the 26th of October in 1937, he references a discussion in Parliament, and in particular, a statement made by William Ormsby Gore, who was then the Colonial Secretary, noting that the minister's words are, quote, practically the same as those he used to utter last year in the House of Commons. Can't the British authorities see at last the futility of what they're doing, he asks. This was in 1937. So today, in 2024, first and foremost, there's absolute urgency to end the genocide being perpetrated against the Palestinian people. Today, almost a full century on, there is yet another opportunity for our political leaders to finally fall on the right side of history. And it is up to all of us, everyone in this room, to really ensure that they take this opportunity. Thank you.
So our final speaker is Tayab Ali. He's the director of the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians, the ICJP, who are hosting this event, and the head of international law at leading London law firm Bindmans. He is an internationally recognised, highly respected solicitor, advocate. He has represented clients in the Supreme Court, the European Court of Human Rights, as well as the international political and legal institutions, including the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, and the African Commission of Human Rights and People's Rights. He has been ranked in legal directories as a leading lawyer in multiple disciplines and described as, I love this quote by the way, an irresistible force. He's fearless and he always gets the right results for his clients. What check cleared before you got that quote? In 2009, Tayab jointly led a legal team which successfully obtained an arrest warrant in the UK for Israeli Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni. So give a warm round of applause to Tayab.
I'm going to just start by saying I'm the last speaker, so it'll be over soon. And you're my friends. And the reason you're my friends, without me knowing any of you, and knowing what you think about Palestine or Israel, or the situation there, is because you're here to listen, and that's really important, and that's the first step. And so it doesn't matter to me what you think, it matters to me that you're here, and I'm very grateful for that. I do want to start by stating something obvious, and it's unfortunate that I have to do that, but in this age of fake news, propaganda and spin, and last week's report of my speech in the Telegraph, I think it's important that I should start this way. So let me tell you, I do not condone the unlawful killing or taking of life, whether that life is Palestinian or Israeli. It's really important to state that. I shouldn't have to state that, but it's important I do state that. A war crime is a war crime, whether it's perpetrated by an Israeli or a Palestinian. It's really important to state that. The killing in Gaza, West Bank and East Jerusalem should stop. And yes, I think the hostages should also be released. All the hostages, whether they're Israeli hostages held by Hamas or Palestinians held by Israel. It's really important to state that. On October the 9th, 2023, last year, I gave a speech in this building at the Labour Party conference. And this was just 2 days after the events of October the 7th. In that speech, I wanted to reflect and explain 2 things. The first was what many commentators had predicted and foretold about what would come to pass in Israel. This includes Labour's own Baroness Margaret Hodge, who had written warnings about Netanyahu and his government earlier in 2023. And I'm going to quote her words, and if the Telegraph are listening, please take note. Deeply anti-democratic proposals being considered by Benjamin Netanyahu's new extreme right-wing government, alongside a renewed assault on the homes and basic rights of Palestinians living in the occupied territories, will only deepen division and heighten tensions. I agreed with Margaret. October the 7th did not come out of nowhere. Israel's belligerent occupation and the failure of the international community to hold Israel accountable for its numerous international law violations, combined with its extreme right-wing government, led to the explosion of violence on October the 7th. This is not to justify it. I'll say that again for the Telegraph. This is not to justify it. But if we want to understand and prevent the violence in Israel and Palestine, we have to be honest about it. And secondly, understanding Israel's clear track record of violating international law meant that it was about to inflict on Palestinians a form of collective punishment that would result in loss of Palestinian life that would dwarf the violence on October the 7th. And Israel would try to hide this act of vengeance behind the thin veil of self-defense. You know, I predicted around 200,000 deaths, and people thought that was an exaggerated number. But nearly 1 year on, our predictions, mine and Margaret Hodges, have sadly proven to be true. We have seen tens of thousands of Palestinians killed in Gaza, including women and children, and 2 million people starved to further a military and political strategy. We have seen the destruction of the entire civilian infrastructure in Gaza, including hospitals, schools, water facilities, bakeries. Do you know, there's no point listing it anymore. They've destroyed everything. But what have we seen? We've seen the International Court of Justice rule that allegations made by South Africa were plausible, which meant credible, and required the court to make interim orders to prevent Israel from continuing it. We have seen the ICC prosecutor find sufficient evidence to apply for arrest warrants for crimes against the Israeli Prime Minister and 2 other members of his government, as well as members of Hamas. In my view, we have not seen any credible attempt at stopping the violence or releasing the hostages. We have seen the US and the UK continuing to support Israeli action and make themselves complicit in alleged war crimes. And we await the imminent arrival of arrest warrants. But we read reports in the press that the Labour government is more concerned with political fallout than the application of law, which might prevent the further loss of life in Palestine. The Labour government must unequivocally support warrants when they're issued and make it clear that this is the position it will take when they're eventually issued. As we sit here, Israel has expanded the conflict to Lebanon, and members of Israel's extremist government are already threatening the whole of Lebanon with the same fate it's meting out to Gaza. Another prediction for you. If we don't restrain Israel right now, what happened in Gaza will happen in Lebanon. Not just to Hezbollah, but to all of Lebanon. Instead of any meaningful measures, our politicians remain steadfast in making empty slogans and calling for ceasefire in the most meaningless and in fact insulting way. Despite meeting Israeli hostage families, there is an unexplained and unforgivable reluctance to meet Palestinian families who have lost loved ones in Gaza, at least to meet them in public. So where are Labour's values when it comes to the alleged genocide in Gaza? The Labour government has taken some steps in the right direction. We must recognise them. UNRWA is refunded by the Labour government. The ICJ jurisdiction objection has been withdrawn by the Labour government. And some weapons licences have been suspended by the Labour government. But most noticeably and worryingly, not for fighter planes. But all this stands in stark contrast by the Labour government's decision to abstain in the recent General Assembly vote to end the occupation. The UK abstained along with 42 other states, with only 14 countries voting against the motion, and a massive majority of 124 voting to end the occupation. Labour is supposed to be delivering change. But the Labour government, like the Tory government before it, is out of step with law and the international community. The legal situation in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories was not complicated before October the 7th. It's not complicated now, unless you're beholden to Israel's powerful lobby machine and not only believe the spin, but promote it. I want to make for you today the legal position clear on Israel's decades-long occupation and subjugation of the Palestinians. Now, if seeing maimed men, women and children in their tens of thousands killed by Israel in acts amounting to war crimes is not enough to compel politicians to work to prevent potential genocide, then let me make the legal position crystal clear. On the 19th of July 2024, the International Court of Justice settled the law in its advisory opinion on the legality of Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territories. The opinion was followed by a United Nations General Assembly request in December 2022. This opinion carries immense weight. It's not just something that some judges thought about. It has settled the legal position. This is the world's highest court's interpretation of the law as it relates to the occupation of Palestine. As political leaders, it is crucial that you fully grasp the legal implications of this decision, not only for Israel and Palestine, but also for our obligations as members of the international community. In simple terms, the court was asked to assess the legal consequences of actions taken by Israel over decades and how those actions impact on the legal status of the occupation. Additionally, the court was asked to examine what legal obligations arise for other states and for the United Nations in response to the situation. Now, I urge all of you to read the judgment in full, or listen to it on YouTube. It takes an hour and a half. But just for today, I would like to quickly summarize some key parts of the judgment. Bear this in mind. There is no longer room for debate. The law is settled. So first, the sovereignty of the occupied Palestinian territory. The court ruled that the OPT is to be considered a single territorial unit. So what does that mean? This means that failure to recognize Palestine as a state is out of step with settled international law. Palestine has now taken a seat at the General Assembly, and the British government, our government, the government of the UK, the Labour Party government, still do not recognize it. They want to wait for permission from the occupying Israeli state before it's prepared to recognize Palestine. A ridiculous, unlawful position. Settlements. The court ruled that both settlements and outposts in the West Bank and East Jerusalem were unlawful. Full stop. Unequivocal. They're unlawful. Despite Israel's domestic law claiming that settlements can be lawful. They're not. They're unlawful. The court ruled that Israel's exploitation of natural resources was unlawful. Plain and simple. Annexation. The use of settlements and outposts was an attempt by Israel to annex Palestinian land and permanently cede it to Israel. Again, a clear violation of international law. What did it say about the occupation? The court ruled that Israel occupied Gaza. It ruled that it occupied the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And it ruled that that occupation was unlawful and is unlawful. It also ruled that occupation must be brought to an end. Apartheid. Now, I understand from the press that there were some issues about use of the word apartheid, but I'm going to use it. I'm going to use it because the ICJ ruled on it. The ICJ highlighted that Israel's discriminatory legislation and measures against Palestinians constitute systematic racial discrimination, also known as apartheid. This is no longer debatable. Israel participates in acts that amount to apartheid. That is the legal position. Now, it is consistent with Labour values, in fact British values, to uphold the law and work to reverse the occupation in Palestine by holding Israel accountable for the violations outlined in the ICJ ruling. What then are the legal consequences of these findings for Israel? Well, the court's decision is clear. Israel must cease its unlawful activities. This includes halting all new settlement activity, repealing discriminatory legislation, and reversing measures aimed at altering the demographic composition of the occupied Palestinian territories. Israel is also under an obligation to provide full reparation for the damage caused by its wrongful acts. This includes returning land, property, and assets seized since the occupation began in 1967, and allowing displaced Palestinians to return to their original places of residence. And finally, I'm going to ask for permission in a minute. What does this mean for the UK government, for the Labour government? The court made it clear. Other states, including the UK, also have obligations. The court emphasised that all states are required not to recognise the illegal situation created by Israel's actions, the OPT, including the annexation of territory and the discriminatory regime imposed on Palestinians. States are obligated to distinguish between Israel's own territory and the OPT in their dealings with Israel. This means that no state should engage in trade, investment, or diplomatic relations that would entrench Israel's unlawful presence in the OPT. States must abstain from recognising any changes to the physical character, demographic composition, or status of the OPT, and refrain from supporting activities, including economic dealings, that would support or maintain the illegal situation created by Israel. In simple terms, in the simplest terms possible, to make it crystal clear, any assistance, be it economic, be it political, be it military, that helps sustain Israel's illegal presence in the OPT is a violation of international law. This advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice is a landmark in the legal and political struggle over the fate of the Palestinian people and the integrity of international law. It places clear legal responsibilities on Israel to end its illegal occupation, cease settlement expansion, and dismantle the discriminatory regime it has imposed. At the same time, it highlights the obligations of all states, including the United Kingdom, to ensure that the rule of law prevails. We are duty-bound to act, not only in the interest of justice and human rights, but to uphold the very principles of international law of which this party should be a bastion and protector without fear or favour. Thank you.